everyone to the second of the APORDE seminars that we're hosting this year. As if people would have attended yesterday, they would know that this is a virtual seminar series because of COVID-19, and we aren't holding the regular APORDE training, and we're having a series of 5 public seminars. This public seminar is a book launch that we are hosting, and we'll be hearing all about the book and the author from the authors. And we also have a discussant, Lumkile Mondi, who's going to be giving us some insights into the book as well. NIKI is struggling a little bit with power, and she'll introduce them. And if not, then I'll take over the introductions. So just before we hand over to NIKI to start, my name is SAUL, your chairperson for today. I'm from an organization called TIPS, and I co-chair with NIKI CATTANEO the APORDE program. And we are supported by the Industrial Development Corporation, IDC, and the South African Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, who support the APORDE program. And this year would have been the 14th running of APORDE. Although it's in a slightly abridged and different version, something we're all getting used to. Let me hand over to NIKI to introduce our speakers for today and to introduce the book. Thanks, NIKI.
Thank you, Saul. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? I'm sorry, we don't have power here, and it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. Thank you very much. I'm not going to spend time introducing the book, but just to say that this book is directed at policymakers, scholars, students and development practitioners in Africa and beyond. It challenges conventional wisdoms about economic performance on the continent and associated policy prescriptions. Grounded in evidence-based research derived from the author's decades of experience on the continent, coupled with political economy insights, the book critiques a range of mainstream and alternative narratives on Africa, on economic performance and policy making. We're very privileged to have all 3 of the authors with us, as well as our discussant. And I'd like to just briefly spend a few minutes introducing the authors. First of all, we have Prof. Chris Cramer, who is Professor of the Political Economy of Development at School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He has chaired the Centre of African Studies in the University of London, and is Vice Chair of the Royal Society and a Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences. He taught at Cambridge University, at Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique, and in South Africa. His research interests range from the political economy of violence, through rural poverty and labor markets, to industrial policy and the industrialization of freshness. His prize-winning book, Civil War is Not a Stupid Thing, Accounting for Violence in Developing Countries, was published in 2006. Together with colleagues, he led a 4-year study, Fair Trade, Employment and Poverty Reduction in Ethiopia and Uganda. He's worked as a consultant for a range of organizations, including the Ethiopian government and the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa. He was co-editor with Fantu Cheru and Arkebe Oqubay of the Oxford University Press Handbook on the Ethiopian Economy, and he chairs the scientific committee of APORDE. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Our second author, John Sender, is Emeritus Professor of Economics at SOAS. Earlier appointments include Director of the African Studies Centre at the University of Cambridge, Visiting Professor of Political Economy at Wits University, a Senior Research Fellow at the African Studies Centre, and Advisor to Mandela's Presidential Commissions on Labour and on Rural Credit. He's acted as a consultant to a range of organizations, including the ILO, UNIDO, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the federal governments of Nigeria and Ethiopia. John's publications are too numerous to mention at this brief introduction, but they do include the 1993 MERG report, Making Democracy Work, a framework for macroeconomic policy in South Africa, as well as restructuring the labour market, the South African Challenge, published by the ILO in 1996. Also, How to Do and Not to Do fieldwork on fair trade and rural poverty, fair trade and labour markets in Ethiopia and Uganda, as well as 2 chapters in the 2019 Oxford Handbook of the Ethiopian Economy, A Bias to the Poorest, What Do We Know About Poorest Ethiopians and How Policy Affects Them, as well as Policy, Political Economy and Performance in Ethiopia's Coffee Sector. And then thirdly, our third author is Dr. Arkebe Oqubay, who's Senior Minister and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and has been at the center of policy making in that country for over 25 years. Dr. Arkebe is a distinguished fellow at the London-based Overseas Development Institute, a UNU wider research fellow, a research associate at the Center of African Studies at the University of London. He holds a PhD in development studies from SOAS, and his recent publications include Made in Africa, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, How Nations Learn, Technological Learning, Industrial Policy and Catch-up, OUP 2019, the Oxford Handbook of Industrial Hubs and Economic Development 2020, and the Oxford Handbook of Industrial Policy 2020. He is a professor at the University of Johannesburg, a visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and a distinguished visiting professor at Fudan University in Shanghai. He is the former mayor of Addis Ababa and currently serves as board chair of several leading public organizations and international advisory boards. Dr. Arkebe was recognized by the New African as one of the 100 most influential Africans of 2016 and a leading thinker on Africa's strategic development for his work on industrialization and industrial policy, both theoretical and practical. So welcome very much to all our authors, and on our discussant, Lumkile Mondi. He's a lecturer at the School of Economics and Finance at Wits University. His research interests include political economy, macroeconomics, competition and regulation, and public sector economics. Mr. Mondi served in President Zuma's State-Owned Enterprises Presidential Review Committee and previously as the member of President Mbeki's Economic Advisory Panel. He holds an MA in economics from Eastern Illinois University in Charleston and is currently finalizing his doctorate through the School of Economics and Finance at Wits University, under the supervision of Professors Vishnu Padiachi and Keith Breckenridge. Welcome, Lumkile. Back to you, Saul.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and thanks to all our panelists who are joining us and all the participants. We are going to take the speakers in their order, so you'll let us know who wants to speak. Just a few house rules for those who weren't with us yesterday. If you want to speak, we'll have opportunities for Q&A after the speakers have given their input and after Lumkile has given his input as discussant. There's 2 options. One is you can put up your hand. If you see on your screen, there's a raise hand function. You can click on that and then we'll allow you to unmute and then you can ask your question. Or you'll see there's also the Q&A function. You can type your question in there and then we'll go through the Q&A that's written up and we'll have a chance to have that discussion. We also encourage people to use the chat. I've just put some information about the upcoming APORDE seminars on the chat, and Chris has also given the link so that you can download the book for free onto the chat as well. So we encourage people to use the technology and to engage with us. Those who were with us yesterday would have found the discussion to be quite rich, and we had a really insightful group discussion, and I think it was useful to have people raise their hands and also to share their insights through the Q&A and the chat. So we're looking forward to a similarly good discussion today. Allow me then to hand over to the panel. Chris, John, Arkebe, who speaks first?
I'm the one to start, I guess. First, let me thank APORDE for creating this platform and organizing this webinar. And allow me also to thank our participants and panelists as well. Today we'll be discussing about our new book. And let me try to take you back some 60 years back, when there were only 3 independent African countries. And 6 decades back, a book so-called Dangerous was published. And the author highlights in his book, in his preface, reminding us this point, a Washington friend of mine worried too about the dangerous thoughts he had detected in my manuscript, that he would like to see its distribution limited to a small circle. And this book was reprinted 10 times within 6 years. And this is a book called The Strategy of Economic Development, authored by Albert Hirschman. And it's a very small book. And the reason observers considered it dangerous was, according to Hirschman, the key driving motive for him to write this small book was disagreement with prevailing doctrines is a natural concomitant of such an effort. Existing theories had seemed to me to be particularly unhelpful to the decision maker in underdeveloped countries. This has been a key driver for us. And his book starts with a quote from Whitehead. And the quote is, "The illustration of immediate experience is the sole justification of any thought. And the starting point for thought is the analytic observation of components of this experience." So as we could see, the motive to write this book was not led by the intention to write a highly abstract, intellectual driven book, but it was primarily motivated by to produce a book that serves this continent, that's based on evidence, and that becomes a useful guide to policymakers. And the origin of this book is based, the three of authors, we have tried to rely and to take a lot of lessons from many books and evidences related with this continent. And it has benefited the book from decades of teaching, especially from my co-authors, Chris and John Sanders. John Sanders, one of the books on Africa, which refers capitalism in Africa, was written in 1986. And both of them have almost 7 decades combined teaching experience. And this is quite important because teaching engages with students, and teaching is interactive and provides good opportunity to learn. The second aspect that we can see on the origin of this book is the extensive researches, especially related with critical economic issues in urban or rural areas. So the decades of fieldwork has been an important input for this book as an important input, and it has enriched the approach of scientific investigation. In addition to this, we have also primarily benefited from decades of policy experience and policy workers. I had the opportunity to be involved in high-level policymaking for almost 30 years, in addition to my leadership role during the liberation movement, 17 years. And also, Chris and John has been involved in advising many governments, including Ethiopian government, South African, Mozambique, and many more governments. So the experience has been quite direct with policy. I would like also to bring that we had in 2013, we designed a new package, a new program about 10 sessions. And these sessions were designed for a discussion with former Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn, and it was a closed session. So we selected 10 topics. We brought leading scholars from London, from Cambridge, and it covers diverse topics, but critical topics. And each session took about 3 days. And it was a very open discussion that brings debates and also concerns on issues. And that showed that the practical problems usually raised by policymakers are quite different from what is written in textbooks or in leading economic books. So this Addis Ababa session, about 10 sessions, which involved more than a dozen leading scholars, was one key motivation to work on this book. And the book had to focus on Africa economic development. We chose economic development as a very important anchor to capture key leading topics. And it has to be based on evidence. Evidence has been the cornerstone. So the book has 3 building blocks. One is to rely on evidence. And secondly, we can only understand evidence from a theoretical perspective. And then it's important to bring in and to bring from the lens of theories as well. And ultimately, the purpose has to change the world, to change the lives of Africans, and policy becomes critical. So that's why the book is African Economic Development, Evidence, Theory, and Policy. This is an unusual book, and according to Oxford University Press, it's an impact book and has been priced quite at low price to encourage wider readership. So the book aims to be useful to policy officials, and it doesn't attempt that it has answers to all questions, but it tries to bring all the issues and key concerns that always is in the mind of policymakers. So it's absolutely important for policy officials, and it reflects the messy world of policymakers. And as you may see, the picture of an image of William Kentridge, which South Africans know quite well. It reflects the messy world that policymakers have to live in. The second aspect is students and scholars will be benefiting from this book as well. When we say students, we are not expecting they will be taking the basic textbook lessons from this book, but it's going to serve as an important reading material as it has rich bibliography, a lot of evidence. So researchers, students will be able to benefit from this volume. It's not a research monograph on specific issue, but it covers and builds from many of the researches directly conducted by authors, and also where we feel there is sufficient basis and reliable evidence from other researchers. The book is not prescriptive. It doesn't try to appear that there are solutions for all problems of Africa. So it's not prescriptive. It brings some broad perspectives, but the authors have restrained themselves not to give very detailed recommendations and prescriptions. We hope this is going to provoke a productive debate, and we are not trying to repeat what other leading development schools or schools like Harvard or universities in developing countries try to present. We are primarily, we want this book to be different and to differentiate itself by bringing the critical issues to the forefront. We have relied primarily on development economics and political economy. We cannot understand economic development isolated from the political environment, from politics. So it's highly based on these perspectives, but a key guiding principle has been to rely on interdisciplinary perspective. So in the book, you will see references and quotes from historians. It brings in historical perspective, references from soil and climate scientists, from public health. So interdisciplinary is absolutely important in order to have a comprehensive and deeper understanding of our continent. We also have tried to bring in a long bibliography. We have cut a significant part of references which we aim to make them available on a relevant website. But the bibliography would be indicative and will be helpful for researchers to continue their researches. This has been our intention, and it will be up to the reader to judge whether we have been able to succeed to meet our objectives. On this occasion, I would like to thank also Adam Swallow, who is now among the participants of this webinar, who has been fully supportive of this project. And of course, we have a lot of names to be acknowledged, which is indicated in our book. We haven't presented slides. We'd encourage all participants to look at the open access of this book. It's an open access book, so anyone can freely download the whole book. And the introduction will provide the overview of this book. However, those of you who are interested to use or to look at the slides, we'll be glad to share the slides at the end of the session. Thank you very much, and I pass to Chris.
Good. Thank you very much, Arkebe. I hope everybody can hear me. Just to reiterate a couple of things that Arkebe just told you all. This book is not a research monograph, but it draws on a lot of very, very deep research of our own, all three of us, and of course of others. It's not a textbook, but we do want it to be used in, and think it will be helpful in teaching. It's not a policy manual either, but it is very much geared towards the problems that policy officials face. And it is a book of economics, but it's not like most books of economics in that partly it is extremely, well, relatively interdisciplinary. We draw on a wide range of sources beyond the narrowly economic. I'm not going to run you through the table of contents. You can all see that in the free downloaded PDF that Arkebe has just mentioned and that I put in the chat function at the beginning of this discussion. So what I want to do now is just to introduce some of the themes that run through many of the chapters, much of the book. And the first theme that I think is important in this book is evidence. That may seem surprising to mention, but actually we think and we argue that we pay more attention to the availability, the adequacy, the veracity, the reliability or otherwise of evidence than most standard books of economics. So if you think, for example, of a number of forms of conventional wisdom in development economics, the idea that throughout Africa and elsewhere, small farms are more efficient than larger farms. The idea that the poorest people tend to live in large households. The idea that there has always been a declining terms of trade for Africa. These things, these forms of conventional wisdom and many others that we explore, we think rest on very, very inadequate and unreliable evidence. And we go to great pains to show the difficulties with that evidence and to argue for a much greater level of investment in the proper collection of more and better quality evidence. The other problem is analytical, which is the way in which many economists throttle us. They asphyxiate us with averages and sort of swamp the kind of the reality of huge variations that's within countries and between countries in Africa. So that's our first theme, which is that of evidence and the way in which that poses a problem for policy officials, for scholars and researchers and students. And the second theme that we highlight is something that, following Albert Hirschman, who Arkebe mentioned earlier, we call possibilism. In other words, we steer a course, we try to steer a course between two things that we think is common in much of the literature on economic development in Africa. And the first is pessimism, undue, extreme pessimism. The idea that it's impossible for Africa to industrialize because of things like premature deindustrialization that cannot be escaped. The idea that there's no hope really in Africa of a large-scale expansion of formal sector wage labor. The idea that crop yields might be declining in Africa. The idea that there's no real hope for Africa to engage in international trade, and therefore the best that can be hoped for is some localized intra-regional trade. The idea that there's no policy space for African governments because of the overriding, overbearing power of international rules and institutions, organizations like the IMF and the World Trade Organization and so on. Or the idea that there's no real hope of progressive policymaking because of the domination of the political marketplace and the politics of the belly everywhere. We don't agree with the extremes of those pessimistic views, but nor do we agree with the kind of naive pessimism that proposes that actually everything could be lovely and wonderful and smooth and very rapidly developing for everybody and inclusively and sustainably so throughout Africa, if only we could remove a series of blockages, distortions, impediments. Very often they're highlighted as market distortions. And when you look more closely, you find that the list of if-onlys, the ifs that you need to remove for this lovely alternative world to unfold smoothly is terribly long. So it's another form of naive impossibilism, if you like. So we try and steer a course between naive optimism and excess pessimism, and we call that possibilism. The third theme that I want to highlight now very briefly is that of embracing imbalance. And we do that in a couple of ways. We insist that capitalist development, not only in Africa, but everywhere, and historically so, is unbalanced, it's contradictory, it's uneven, and it's in fact brutal everywhere. And it often involves change, not only through incremental adjustments, but through shocks, through sudden changes and imbalances that are often rather unpredictable. That's very different from many of the ideas common to forms of neoclassical economics and comparative advantage theorists. And it's the idea captured in the famous epitaph to Alfred Marshall's early 20th century book, The Principles of Economics, which is the idea that natura non facit saltum, nature doesn't make big leaps. We don't think that's actually a very accurate way of capturing economic development in Africa or elsewhere. And the final theme I want to highlight now, which John will talk a little bit more about, and then I will later illustrate with one example, is the importance of policies that sustain high levels of demand and that promote public sector-led investment in selected high productivity activities that meet particular criteria that John will emphasize with you. And I'm going to pass over to John now.
Oh, immediately. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's important, we argue, to sustain high levels of domestic demand. This is for many reasons, but perhaps the most important of them is that when you look at those countries that have not done well historically or in particular parts of the world, it has been because they have been subject to, or they've suffered, huge declines in demand, recessions. In other words, what's required for improvements in people's standards of living is that demand be sustained over time. And we go on to argue that what is required in order to sustain demand in African economies and elsewhere is that there are policy interventions that concentrate both public and private sector investment on a particular set of activities. In other words, it's not digging holes in the ground and filling them up, public sector investment to do that. There are particular activities that make a huge difference, or could possibly make a huge difference in Africa. And we identify the types of activities that public sector investment and private sector investment too should be encouraged to focus upon. Perhaps the most important criterion of concentration is that one wants to invest in areas or in projects or in subsectors which create the demand for the labor of those who are in the weakest position in the labor market. And that in Africa usually means women who have little education. The sort of things we have in mind are investment in high-value agricultural production, which is often actually manufacturing or industrial in its nature. It often involves quite complex and sophisticated products, as well as in the areas where Arkebe is a world authority, that's to say in urban, peri-urban manufacturing factories of a more traditional kind. Secondly, a second criterion that's really important in thinking about focus is that state support should only be allocated to those areas, those projects, those subsectors that are capable of making a rapid contribution to foreign exchange earnings, because foreign exchange earnings are required to sustain accumulation. Usually a period of recession, of failure to sustain accumulation, is preceded by inadequate foreign exchange availability. Therefore, a quick and sustained improvement in foreign exchange earnings, a net contribution quickly achieved to foreign exchange earnings, is an essential criterion for public sector support for investment. The third thing that has to be done in this investment strategy, the third criterion or the third objective, is that it's absolutely critical, we argue, to create the capacity to monitor and to intervene in food markets. Of course, intervention in food markets is an anathema to a large part of the conventional wisdom of economists. But we think that in order to sustain an accumulation strategy politically, it's absolutely crucial to intervene to smooth price spikes, especially in the food grains that are consumed by the majority of poor people in Africa, in those sorts of commodities, food commodities, wage goods that are consumed by the poor. And finally, it's critical, an important criterion by which one judges public sector investment and private sector investment allocated to, supported by the public sector, is that we argue that the criterion should be to focus on infrastructure provision and on R&D on particular subsectors and crops, for example, especially, to repeat the point made above, that the infrastructure and the R&D expenditure should be focused on those sorts of activities, those sorts of crops that make a major contribution to exports and to domestic wage goods supply. Take a South African example, say from the experience of the IDC, which Lumkile is very familiar with. We would not be in favor of an investment to support the production of milk, dairy goods, mainly because they don't make a rapid net contribution to foreign exchange requirements, and secondly, because dairy products are not the most important goods consumed by the poorest rural South Africans. There are basic food grains which are much more important, such as mealies or sorghum. The type of commodity to which you allocate your support must look at whether or not it makes a major contribution to the calorie needs of the poorest people in African countries, and whether or not it makes a rapid net contribution to foreign exchange earnings. Okay, I think that's time to hand over. Is it not?
It might be a good idea, John, if you carry on for a moment talking about wage employment, and then I'll illustrate.
Chris, in what he had to say, focused on three themes, but two in particular, on evidence and on possibilism. One of the chapters, the chapter on agricultural policy, provides quite a good illustration of the sorts of things perhaps he had in mind, or we have in mind. In this chapter, we reject, and we subject to heavy criticism, the sort of labor market evidence that's used by both mainstream economists, people working out of North American institutions, for example, and by their critics, people in JNU in Delhi, or people in some of the branches of UNCTAD and UNDP. So we reject the labor market evidence that's used both by conventional economists and by some of the critics of conventional economists. We try to argue why it's important that labor market statistics are improved. Bad labor market data, we argue, underpins the pessimism that's so widespread about the possibilities for a faster rate of growth of wage employment in Africa. Just as a very crude and very simple example, we know that in Africa, a large numbers of even lower middle class people employ domestic servants. That's familiar, of course, to people in South Africa, but it's also the case in many other countries. And in the book, we provide evidence on the importance of this sector of the market for wage labor. The problem is that this wage labor, the wage labor of domestic servants, like the wage labor of children, is simply not counted in almost all official statistics about the growth of employment in Africa. There are many other examples of other areas of wage employment that are neglected, poorly counted, and it has to do with quite nerdy and complicated things about how surveys are designed, which I won't go into now. But we see the possibility, we argue that it is possible, that there could be a growing political role for an African proletariat, and we criticize the economic and political benefits that could be gained, or that people imagine could be gained, by the policies they promote to encourage self-employment and small entrepreneurs. So that final line gives you an idea of how, if you like, provocative and different from most textbooks or books on economics of Africa that you will have seen before. We are not fans of policies which allocate large amounts of resources to promoting self-employment and small entrepreneurs, on the grounds that we argue that the opportunities and possibilities for promoting wage employment are overlooked, at least in part, apart from ideological reasons, in part because of a failure to have adequate evidence. Now can I hand over?
Great. Yes, let me pick up on that and on the themes of evidence, of possibilism, and of wage employment expansion and public sector policy that John's been talking about. And I want to do so by giving you a little illustration, an example of the dynamics, some of the dynamics of structural change in play in the town of Ziway in Ethiopia, southeast of Addis Ababa. And I can show you a little animated map, I hope. Right, so you should see, yeah, if you may need to move your tab with the pictures of us, but you'll see a picture that changes every few seconds, and it moves between 2003 and 2020. And you'll see in the earlier picture, there are some green and browny fields underneath the lake. In the top right-hand corner, there's a lake, and there's a small town. And later many of the fields replaced by what you may be able to work out are greenhouses. They're floriculture greenhouses for the export of roses. So this is a story really that draws on research by the three of us, different research projects. Arkebe's own research into industrial policy and the way industrial policy played out across different sectors in Ethiopia, including the floriculture sector, and research that John and I did with SOAS colleagues, Deborah Johnston and Carlos Oya, on labor markets in floriculture and coffee in Ethiopia, and as it happens also on coffee and tea in Uganda as well. And Ziway was one of the places, it was one of the centers for the initially very dramatic, very rapid expansion of the cut flower industry, the floriculture sector in Ethiopia. It's an example of where public policy and incentives led to foreign investments in a number of firms in Ziway and elsewhere, which replaced, if you like, a low productivity farming in those original fields with much higher productivity, export-oriented flower production. So meeting that criteria that John just mentioned, the other criteria was met because these investments generated very large and quite rapid increases in wage employment. And you can see, I hope, as you switch between 2003 and 2020, the way in which the town itself, the area, the boundaries of the town expand. And that's because large numbers of people were migrating, sometimes from really quite far away distances in Ethiopia, attracted by the labor market opportunities that the flower farms created, both directly and particularly for poor women, and also indirectly and induced. So there was a large number of new restaurants, bars, hairdressers, security guards, petty manufacturing, construction enterprises, all sorts of things that grew up and span out around this flower sector, underpinned by government policies. So the dynamics were very, very important and very much policy-led there. I think just one further thing to say about this is the theme of linkages that we discuss in the book. There are two different kinds of linkages that I might pick up. One is, again, if you look west of the town, 2003, it looks rather barren and inactive, but if you can look closely, those of you with big screens perhaps, you look at 2020 and you look west and you'll see that area is replaced with very, very detailed, marked out agricultural fields. So one of the things that's going on is a rise in agricultural activity and in productivity in that area. And in fact, you can't quite see it in this map, but if you look to the north of the town, closer to the lake, there's a lot of it's grown remarkably in that period, a lot of relatively high value production of onions, tomatoes, spices, chilies, food, mainly domestic food consumption. So there's all sorts of linkages between what is effectively industrial flour production for export and domestic agricultural activity. The other kind of linkage, both backward and forward, that's very important to the success, the relative success and growth of the flour sector in Ethiopia, has been something very remarkable in Ethiopia, which is a very, very successful, long-established, state-owned enterprise, which is Ethiopian Airlines. And the presence of the airline and its reputation for very good management was an important kind of backward linkage that facilitated those floriculture investments. And at the same time, there was then a feedback from the flour sector and the demands that investors there placed on the airport authorities and the airline to the expansion of cold storage facilities at the airport, the development of logistics capabilities, which themselves have spread out into different sectors of Ethiopian economic performance in recent years. There are very unpredictable and quite interesting implications of those capability developments for Ethiopia's experiences more recently in managing the COVID-19 crisis. But I want to just ask Arkebe if he would like to say a little bit more about Ethiopian Airlines. South Africans are often quite interested in the experience as well.
Thank you, Chris. Our book deals on the unconventional thoughts and that development is not linear. And there is no better example than the story of Ethiopian Airlines that shows this. Because in economics lessons, we are told countries should follow their comparative advantage. While in reality, you cannot catch up by only following or by only relying on your own comparative advantage. And the story of Ethiopian Airlines is interesting because the airline came into existence and has now become a comparative advantage from scratch. In 1945, just after the end of World War II, a high-level delegation of Ethiopian government went to Washington, and they submitted the message to US authorities, and they discussed with Transport Department, and the question was, the request was a crazy request. The emperor wanted to establish an airlines. There was no runway in Ethiopia at all. Even there were not much car vehicles during that time. There was no technician at all, let alone pilot. So the Americans smiled, but they didn't want to disappoint the emperor. Then the delegation had to discuss with TWA, one of the four major carriers in the US at that time. And it was agreed that the airline will be established immediately. And within 6 months, the airlines was established, and the Ethiopian government requested the management of TWA for some years to develop capability. So not only pilots, technicians, managers, CO were Americans, but even the cabin crew were Americans. And the vehicle, also the aircraft, the government didn't have much money, and the aircraft bought at that time were used aircraft, logistics aircraft, thrown away after the end of World War II in Alexandria in Egypt. So they picked 4 or 5 of this aircraft, and it started. Within a decade, its first flight to Accra was inaugurated. And within less than 10 years, pilot school was established, technician school was established. And then the main focus was on a key strategy was indigenization, that know-how transfer is conducted in a very aggressive way. The American team were not so enthusiastic about it, but it was one of the key driving factor that helped to develop the capability. The Ethiopian Airlines story is also a story that with conventional economics, we are told that privatization is best, and governments are not good managers of public enterprises. This is a story we know. But the truth is, as you could see, this is early 50s with the American management team. These are the female crew, including the pilot, all full cabin, full crew flights are conducted periodically. So we could see the pilot, the co-pilot, the hostess, the technician, and it's symbolic because it's about women, the social status of women is being increased from time to time, and it's quite motivating also to the younger generation. Here, what the Ethiopian Airlines story tells us is that government can make a difference, and state-owned enterprises can be an important drivers of growth and development, as we see in Singapore, but the government should also be disciplined. And many times I refer to this point because our prime minister or president can use aircraft of Ethiopian Airlines, but the Treasury must settle the payment of this aircraft on a regular basis. So a very disciplined approach is what would be learning. I would like to highlight 2 stories linked with this. In 2008, it was a critical crisis time, financial crisis, which then became economic crisis. And the floriculture sector, I'm coming back to the story of Chris Reyes. And in 2008, the petroleum prices increased by 3 times. And there was no way the flour farmers could pay 3 times the rate. So it was a very testing time. And the cabinet at that time, chaired by late Prime Minister Meles, convened a meeting in the presence of Ethiopian Airlines and the private sector, also the floriculture from the industry. And finally, a deal was made that since this is an external factor beyond anyone's control, that 1/3 of the increase of price would be covered by Treasury. About 1/3 was to be absorbed by Ethiopian Airlines, and about 1/3 by the private sector. And within a few months, the price of petroleum went down, but it made possible that the sector could survive. It's the same thing during this COVID-19. COVID-19 is a major disastrous crisis for the aviation, tourism, and travel industry. So many airlines have gone bankrupt in the last 6 months. And airlines in advanced economies and emerging economies have benefited from economic stimulus by respective government. There is no way the government of Ethiopia could provide rescue package for Ethiopian Airlines. It's impossible because the treasury's capacity is limited. And by the way, Ethiopian Airlines was never subsidized. The government never gives guarantee in loans, and Ethiopian Airlines has to bring from international capital market to finance its aircraft. So the airlines, the board, the management was quite clear that it has to swim or to die. And what happened was the Ethiopian Airlines had to adjust with this situation, and it switched to cargo as cargo business increased. 25 aircrafts were changed from passenger to cargo, and also the productivity of cargo planes increased twice. And by the Ethiopian Airlines fiscal year, which ended June 30, it ended the year without any loss at all, and it didn't lay off any workers. It didn't cut any benefit of its 16,000 workers. So this has been a testing time to improve resilience, and in this case, it shows us the investment on technological capability is critical. Industrial policy is critical because Ethiopian Airlines is serving as a policy instrument, including becoming a national security asset because we are a landlocked country. It also shows the importance of export sector again, because it's the largest exporter of services exporters. Many economists tell us that it's services that is important. This is quite false, but within services, high productivity services will be quite important. And this is a good example that high productivity services could be useful. And it also continuously diversified into hotel business, into airport management, into other areas as well. So this is a typical example that is reflected in our book, and it shows that the importance of linkages and also the concept of possibilism. Chris.
Yeah, I think John is going to bring our little contribution to a close by emphasizing, by provoking people a little bit.
Well, I hope everyone will be able to see a little picture, because it's designed to sort of irritate and provoke people. There are two sort of pictures of Africa, one of which represents what we regard as the arguments we would like to throw in question, criticize, doubt. And the other is the sort of thing we like, or the sort of arguments we support, or we think the evidence, better evidence and possibilistic thinking supports. So we can start with what we've, well, it's gone away.
It's gone away.
What we've just been talking about, which is the notion of privatizing, which is strongly recommended by many people in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa, whereas we pay much more attention to state-owned enterprises and to what state-owned enterprises can achieve. So if you look at the bottom of our map, if it can be put up, we've got state-owned enterprises, and they, the people we're arguing against, have got small and medium enterprises. If you look at the top of our map, we talk about agribusiness and the importance of policies for agribusiness. They talk about policies for smallholders. We talk about proletarianization, They talk about self-employment, NGOs, associations. We talk about high technology and getting the prices wrong. They talk about intermediate technology, labor-intensive technology, or price distortions. We talk about linkages. They talk about enclaves. They talk about bottom-up. We tend to talk about multinational corporations. They are very nervous about imports. They think it's a terrible thing that Africa imports many things, especially food. We think it's absolutely critical to achieve the foreign exchange earnings to accelerate imports, that successful African economies will be economies with fast rates of growth of imports. They like microcredit, we like mega projects. I think you can get the feel of, if you like, how controversial we aim to be and how we want to unsettle conventional thinking about policy and development economics, both in the mainstream and more generally speaking amongst people who are interested in development. Okay. I think it's time for other people to talk now.
Thanks very much, John, Chris, and Arkebe. Let me hand over to Lumkile to give his insights on the book. Thanks, Lumkile.
Thank you so much to John, Chris, and Arkebe. Before reading this book, I was extremely pessimistic, just because I live in an environment where the state finds itself with competing interests and competing options, and remains indecisive in creating a path that could develop this country with a specifically state-led investment, which I believe could create more participation in the labor market, but also lead to high levels of productivity. So when I read the book, the first comment I want to make, which is the quote from the book, is that if you look at the African continent, their seeds have been planted, but their yields have often been considered disappointing. These seeds that have been planted in the African soil, often older ones, rather than the most recently improved cultivars and hybrids, are sown with the folkloric wisdom of the most cited and renowned economists. They represent the common varieties of policy thinking that Chris, John, and Arkebe have drawn attention to in the book. So in the book, they provide the other side and they propose the views that they put on the table. In that case, what they've argued is a concentration of very small number of priorities, which John was talking to at the end, with a focus on larger projects than targeting entrepreneurs and supporting small businesses through microcredit. What for me resonated in the book is the spirit of possibilism, which in fact I found it very profound, given the pessimism that I've described earlier. What possibilism means, my interpretation in the book, is a form of realism, which I think has struck me to an extent, reflecting a past of hope, rooted in pragmatic, often somewhat depressing awareness of the cruel historical record in Africa and globally. A record that is in fact the history of capitalist development. The authors, as you've heard them, are drawing from history, anthropology, and political science. Not only that, agronomists, social scientists, engineers, and what underpins the evidence in this book, because it's African economic development, evidence, theory, and policy, is the experience of the authors. We had Arkebe talking about Ethiopian Airlines and how it emerged from no runway, no possibilities, and through relationships caught up, and today that's where it is. If you look on the chapter on labor poverty, agriculture, and productivity, the two others, John as well as Chris, have spent a lot of time on the field. The question being the weakness in data that's provided across African economies by our central statistics services, whether it's in South Africa, and in certain cases is the World Bank, that the use of that data and the recommendations that come out of it may necessarily not be the correct ones. Some of you will remember the debate between Reinhard and Rogoff against Pauline, where they were exposed about the data they use and the coding that they use. Therefore, in the book, the evidence is supported through primary data collection and experiences that I think John and Chris had spent on the field, trying to ensure that the voices and the experiences of their informants is articulated in a way that could provide evidence for the possibilities that they talk to in Africa. What we do know is that economies and economic policies do not exist in vacuum, sealed from the social relationship or historical patterns of behavior, power relations, and physical environments of which they are part. Rather, they are product of skilled power relation and violent coercion within household and wider social institutions. For me, that puts my understanding of economics and the challenges that we engage as Africans and how to develop and catch up into a much more informed perspective. Let me raise just two issues on theory, which are raised by the authors. First, the view that is proposed by neoclassical economists around investment, that investment should lead and drive long-term economic growth. The authors argue very strongly that raising investment is not necessarily a sufficient objective to accelerate economic growth. What matters is the efficiency and the productivity that accompanies investment. Secondly, what I found very interesting, given where the authors are coming from, was the understanding of investment, which I think Johnson articulated around his support of larger projects compared to small micro projects and entrepreneurs. That the notion where we talk about savings, savings being the dog, that always focusing on savings which end up waging a tail called investment is not a correct way of what you should be looking at. Rather, the dog called investment should work the tail labeled savings, which for me was very profound in the South African debate, given the discussion around the economic recovery and the challenges that are faced by the National Treasury and the Central Bank, where the debate is about how we can use our financial resources for investment, particularly investment that could create a bigger opportunities in infrastructure domestically and in the continent. Whilst talking about infrastructure, the authors are very cautious about regional integration. That regional integration should be encouraged. However, countries should not forget the areas where they've been good at trading with the rest of the world. That as you integrate regionally, don't forget also about internationally. A point John was making around imports, that if you are exporting, you're able to earn hard currency, and in that process able to trade with the rest of the world. Of interest around the investment function is really how South Africa, for example, because the debate is very hot domestically around the role of the central bank, is about the Ethiopian experience. I think Arkebe didn't talk to, given the time, specifically looking at what Ethiopia went through financial repression and how through that financial repression, where interest rates were negative, Ethiopia was able to redirect investment towards infrastructure and had huge multipliers. And its economy has constantly been growing because it was able to build that base. In the South African sense, then the debate is about what can you do with the South African Reserve Bank? Is there a space for the South African Reserve Bank to play a bigger role around investment in bigger projects? The second issue that I want to highlight that relates to investment also is relating to manufacturing. The Caldo multiplier, where we look at manufacturing output and the benefits that it brings. As you know, South Africa has deindustrialized, and the argument of why it's deindustrialized is always put across as though labor costs are very, very high, and therefore cannot compete with the rest of the world around certain products unless we deregulate our labor market. And in doing so, we'll be able to attract more manufacturing within the Southern economy. And the authors are very clear about the issue that wages are very important. And because we all know that how good wages and good profits, if they're reinvested, we can create a spiral of economic growth in the long term. But what I like about investment in manufacturing is also the huge spin-offs that comes of it. The learning by doing, the specialization, and economies of trade. What I do want to go to finalization of my argument is really the economics that is embedded in the book, which is fantastic for us as teachers, where we can use quite a lot of it, particularly around the strategies for economic development in Africa, as well as some of the evidence that's provided. Where I still have challenges, which I would like the authors to respond to, is how in many African countries, there's been a shift away from what we've understood in the Marxist sense of how economic development happens. The shift is driven by indigenization, where social processes lead to formation of elites. And the mechanism of creating those elites in South Africa, for example, include things like Black economic empowerment. Also, where the politicians and the new elite that's been formed through Black economic empowerment goes in partnership with mining companies, and in the process leads to consequences and dispossession of rural land because of mining activities. The authors seem to argue that these processes are good because they prioritize those rural villages. So in the political context of accumulation, as I've put in terms of the sharp processes that we've seen, particularly in South Africa and many others who talk in countries that talk indigenization, how do the authors relate to the social processes that are informed by a method of accumulation, which is very different from what we've understood in the Marxist stance of accumulation? Thank you, Saul. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Lumkile. I think let's open up for some hands from the audience. I don't know if you want to use the function on your screen to raise your hand. We also have some comments in the Q&A and in the chat function. So while people are raising their hand, let me just read through some of those questions. So Fernandez raises a question that her concern is that some of the ideas have been discussed before. What will require the state in Africa to try this out this time? Some of the ideas you present in the book. Okay, and then on the chat function, there's several questions. So one of them is from Malisi, who says, COVID-19 has placed many African countries in a debt dilemma. A number of them are not keen to participate in a debt moratorium due to fears of rating downgrades and denial of access to global markets. How can African countries get out of this conundrum? And then there's a question from Linda who says, I'm interested in the point in the slide of high versus intermediate technology. What do you mean here? The experience of many Asian economies shows that they didn't go straight for high-tech sectors straight away, but rather started with simpler manufacturing. Should that not be most appropriate for African countries as well? Okay, and then the last one is, thank you for your explanation about Ethiopia Airlines. My question, how do you link monopoly and competitiveness in this regard? Okay, and then, so there's been those issues which have been raised, and then I'll allow Francois to say a few words or ask a question. Francois?
Wonderful, wonderful. This is really wonderful. And I want to thank the authors of this extraordinary book. I particularly want to thank Dr. Arkebe, whom I interviewed for his last book. I don't know if you remember, from my magazines. And this is really a book that must be publicized. And the first thing I would like to know is, I publish 2 Pan-African magazines that are mostly news magazines in French and in English. And I think that I would very much like to interview the 3 authors because they are bringing really, really important ideas that are not heard. And I have a lot of things to say. I want to thank the authors very, very much. And I thank APORDE for this wonderful book event. It is incredible what I've heard. And I'm calling from Washington here. And I know that these ideas, we will try to bring it in Washington. I'm also at the PhD department at Harvard Universities, and I will make sure that your ideas penetrate faculties as well as students. Again, thank you again, and I have a lot to say, but I would just ask if you permit, one question to each of the author for the very innovative and provocative and realistic ideas. And I very much like the two maps of Africa with what you say and what they say. So, Dr. Arkebe, one of the things which you said was that we cannot understand development economics without the political environment. I would like to hear you more about it. I know the case of Ethiopia is known because of the type of leadership, but I don't know what is your view on it on the other African countries, because Ethiopia is really an exception. and it is the country that have refused to work according to let's say the consensus, and the success is there that demonstrates the vision of the leadership that have been poorly executed. But I would like to hear you about the rest of the continent, and be a candor and speak possibly without any diplomatic things. And to Dr. Sander, I very much like what he said here. Say, they like microcredit, we like a mega project. I think, please, can you insist on it? And because microcredit has been very much publicized, but I don't know any country that has developed with microcredit. So how can we bring this idea to be heard? This is a continent that needs investment in almost everything. And it is always microcredit, microcredit, microcredit. And we are not seeing these mega projects that are needed. If you want to build dams, you want to build roads, you want to build universities, microcredit, to my knowledge, have not helped to do that. And finally, to Dr. Cramer, he mentioned something that I already touched upon very quickly yesterday, when he mentioned the case of the domestic servants, which are neither count in the GDP or on the employment rate. This brings back the issue of informality, and how are we going to deal with this issue? Are we going to remain a continent with a high level of informality, or are we going to push these people into the formal sectors? What are the strategies, Dr. Cramer, that will advise on this issue? Again, I thank all of you for this wonderful, very innovative book that is quite interesting, and I thank you for the presentation. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Francois. Okay, we've got a few more comments on the Q&A, and then we'll allow Tess Fau to say a few words, and then we'll move to concluding remarks and responses to those questions and comments. So on the Q&A, there's a comment from Ernesto who says, what is the book's perception on corruption in the path to industrialization? And then from Suraj, who says, you do not talk about financialization and its dual impact in terms of driving demand by large and often dominant private businesses for short-term high returns in financial assets, rather than long-term fixed productive investment and the impact of liberalization of cross-border financial flows and the increasing systemic financial problems and macro instability. Okay, there's a lot in that. And then from Mborfi, who's saying, given a low growth, high unemployment, low investment, and high resistance to a living minimum wage, how can demand be spurred? Also, fiscal constraints will limit public investment. In this case, how does South Africa drive an inclusive industrialization agenda? Okay, let me allow Tess Fau to quickly say a few words, and then we'll move to the wrap-up and responses. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. SAUL. First of all, I would like to thank you all, the author of this book. Particularly, my thanks goes to Professor Arkebe. It's not about because of he's from my country, but because of for his contribution for those books. So, having said this, I just have one question. When Professor Arkebe was talking about ZOI, the floriculture industries. So, yeah, that's true. I agree with his explanation, but I just want to ask, as you all know, especially Professor Arkebe, as you know, recently for the last 2 years, there is a domestic violence in this country, and one of the targets is floriculture industries in ZOI area. So how could the country sustain this, the legacy of this, the success story of floriculture in this country? This is one of my questions, and unfortunately I didn't read this book, but I read the previous one, Made in Africa, an industrial industrial policy in Ethiopia. And I read all those success stories in that book. I'm very happy with that. Of course, now we are exercising some challenges regarding on the success stories that were mentioned on the old books. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Professor Arkebe can on it. Just one more question on that. One of the success story in that book was cement industries. That was clear. We were importing cement, for in 2019 2009 to 2011. But after all, with the successful of industrial policy, we're starting exporting cement even to the neighboring countries. But after flourishing all this, now we are in a position to import cement again. I heard recently that the government is to import allow import of cement. So can you say something, Professor Arkebe, in this regard? Thank you very much. I really appreciate all the author of this book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's hand over to the panelists. If we can try and keep it to 5 minutes, and then we'll then close the discussion. I'll ask attendees to hang in for another 5 minutes to get responses to these very insightful and interesting questions. Thanks very much.
I don't know who wants to go first. Arkebe, would you like to respond first to anything? But thank you. I do want to say to Lumkile and others, thank you so much for Lumkile for your probing thoughts, your generous response and good questions, and everybody else also for really interesting points.
Yeah, let me join Chris as well to thank Lumkile also for your excellent discussion about the book. Francois, I exactly remember you quite well, and thank you for the generous offer, and we'll keep in touch for your booking, for your interview as well. To be quite brief, on the intermediate, what we are trying to say is the intermediate technology is the most fashionable word, like microcredits or MSE. I know an industrial village here in Ethiopia during Derg's time, where intermediate technology was imported from India with the assumption it's more appropriate for Ethiopia. What we are trying to say is a much more dynamic and appropriate response would be to develop technological capability in coherence, in line with the industrial policy. That's the key point. On the Ethiopian Airlines, it's competing. Ethiopian Airlines revenue, more than 90% is from international market, and the aviation industry is a very harsh industry. So it's with international competition that is surviving, and it doesn't get any special privilege. Domestically, it's the only service provider, but it's only 10% of its total of the overall businesses. Politics is an important criteria. We know that not only in Ethiopia, but many African countries are going through different, let's say, turmoils, riots, and mass demonstrations. I don't think this is going to stop anytime. It will always be there because the voices have some purpose. They are voicing their concerns, and it's up to the government also to provide a reasonable response. And governments, I mean, this social transformation is a process which is eternal. What we need to say is whether we are moving from a much worse situation into a better situation. And in many African countries, because of the diversity, the nature of diversity of the social fabric, the issue of ethnicity, nationalism will be there for decades. What we need to see is an improved situation from time to time, and also developing the capability to manage these processes. This is the first point I would like to highlight. On the issue of the politics around floriculture, also we need to see it from this perspective. There was cases where farms were burned, but we also see farms that have expanded. These farms usually create employment to the locality, like the Zwai area. It has created tens of thousands of jobs for especially female workers. So I believe these are all temporary phenomena, and situation is going to be improved. And I mean, the key concept of possibilism is that we need to see the brighter side as well. On the cement issue, yeah, Ethiopia is currently has allowed to import cement provisionally. It's for a very short period because there is a demand, additional demand. But what my book tries to show is not about success stories, actually. The central concept in my book is that variation is an essential feature of industrial policy. And there are successes within failed industrial policies, and there are also failures or seeds of failures within successes. So the cement industry within a decade grew, or its output increased from 1.5 million to about 15 million tons installed capacity, putting Ethiopia among the top 3 cement producers. However, we also need to understand that industrial policy is not static. You have to continuously upgrade the technology. You have to continuously update the policy in response to the evolution or the successes and the failures within that specific sector. These are, I think, the points I would like to comment.
Great. Let me try. I mean, there's so many points. I do want to say actually that there are sort of more comments and questions in the Q&A from not only from Siraj, but from Andy Mold, from Hibist Kasa. I don't know if Zoom allows us to write after the event to these people. I'd like to try, because I don't think we have time to address everything here, and it needs addressing. But just very briefly to pick up on a couple of things that Lumkile was talking about, the relationship between investment and efficiency, Linda about technology and so on. I just want to kind of invoke a couple of things. It's impossible probably really to settle this issue about whether you should just slowly invest and become very efficient and prioritize efficiency rather than pushing larger scale investment or the other way around. But I do want to kind of tell you all this little quote from a Chinese official that we use in the book, actually, on this very subject of investment and efficiency, which is that even a really efficient, skillful cook can't make a meal out of nothing. And in fact, nothing, or as you might translate it, low levels of investment and low rates of investment growth is no guarantee of efficiency either. And I think, just to be provocative, one example of that is underinvestment in South Africa in the productive and enabling infrastructure, in hydro infrastructure, in rural internet access and speed, and in port facilities. And the way in which that underinvestment and poor maintenance record is undermining the competitiveness of potentially actually hugely competitive South African agricultural exports, not least fruit exports. And I've been writing something on this with, or she's mainly been writing it with Shingi, who I think is one of our attendants in the last few weeks. So that's one thing. And I think also I would pick up on this, again, a Hirschman issue about investment at the macro level, but also about large projects and levels of technology, which is if you don't try, if you don't experiment with large scale, sophisticated, technically complicated projects, investments, etc. How on earth are you going to develop those capabilities? In the process, there's very often an unbalanced, uneven, and often at first inefficient process, but has to be seen in more dynamic terms. And I think Arkebe's example of Ethiopian Airlines was a brilliant one. Nobody would have recommended that Ethiopia invest in a national airline. Nobody probably would have encouraged Ethiopia to keep this as a state-owned enterprise. In fact, they've encouraged it very much to do the opposite in recent years. And yet the evidence seems to be that low-income countries can actually pull off quite extraordinary capability learning and technologically improving investments. So it's a shame how June had to leave. He was with us, but he might want to comment a little bit more on East Asia, Linda. But that's perhaps a conversation we should expand another time, but it would be good to do that. John, I don't know if you would like to add anything in response to any of the questions.
I'd like just to respond to I think it was one of the very first people who offered a question, which is, why should they listen to us, or why will they start listening to us?
Fernando.
And I think that's a very good question. It's, who do they listen to if they don't listen to us? And I think the answer there is very clear and relates to many things that have been said. They listen to the people who take them out to lunch, the people who give them jobs in Goldman Sachs, who take them to New York to work with JP Morgan. I'm referring, of course, to your current Minister of Finance, Tito, and your previous Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel. These are the sorts of people who have followed the same policies for a number of decades. And the question of possibilism is well illustrated by that. They would argue it's impossible to follow any other policies. Not because they're corrupt and they've been taken out to dinner by Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, but because that's what everybody's told them. The interesting thing is, if you look at Africa, there are variations between countries. And one of the best variations is between Ethiopia, with its state-owned enterprises, its disregard and ignoring of international advice from Washington institutions to restrict public sector expenditure, don't increase the role of the public sector in the economy, don't behave as you are doing towards, to take up Siraj's point, the financial sector. Let in Citibank, liberalize the capital account, liberalize the financial sector. What's interesting, and the variant that's important to emphasize, is that by not doing that, by taking the other view, they've achieved extraordinary things. By being very good boys, by doing exactly what the conventional economists told South Africans to do it, South Africa has presided over what appears to be more or less a disaster since for the last 3 decades. That's perhaps a pessimistic note or an optimistic note on which to end. In other words, there are possibilities for doing other things.
Good. Thank you very much to our panelists and to Lumkile.
If you could give me 1 minute, a very important question on the Q&A point was on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I mean, our approach is not a pessimistic approach. What we are trying to say is there is now euphoria and to see the African Continental Free Trade as the bulletproof for the trade imbalance, for the trade constraints in this continent. What we are trying to say is, first, this continent has to engage with other regions. The main reason that it needs to engage with other regions is not because of importance of diversification of trade origin or destination, but above all, I mean, the products are going to be more sophisticated from time to time. And this means that you have to look for all types of buyers, and you need to widen your net and to build these capabilities. The second point is the African free trade in the absence of investment in productive investment, especially in value addition, in manufacturing, then the continent will not be benefiting because it will only be exchanging of raw materials. And even in the most dynamic region, by the way, like ASEAN, the contribution of within intra-region trade is limited, about 1/4 of the total trade. So if you want to expand the international scope for trade, we need to engage with the other continents. And also what we need to advocate is not just economic integration, but we need to understand the challenges and work to improve and upgrade productive capacity, and also address the issue of infrastructure. It's easier, for instance, for Ethiopia to export to Italy or Germany than exporting to, let's say, Uganda. There is not even an infrastructure that connects us. So what the book tries to say is, to show is this dimension, but it's basically built on the possibilism framework.
Thank you very much. A much nicer way of ending off, John. Thank you for your comments, Arkebe. Thanks very much to everyone for your contributions, for the Q&A, to our panelists, and to Lumkile, our discussant. I think that's been an excellent discussion, and definitely something that has given us food for thought, and hopefully to read the book. So thank you to everyone, and we'll see you for tomorrow, APORDE session. It's at the same time tomorrow at 2:30 in the afternoon. Thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks. Bye.